Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a moment that literally drew a hard line right through human history. A before and an after, decided in the absolute blink of an eye. We're looking at the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we're not just focusing on the blasts themselves, right? We're going to trace the massive geopolitical buildup, the deeply heartbreaking reality for the people on the ground, and the immense global ripples that honestly still dictate how countries interact today. It's a vast, it's a heavy, and it's an absolutely crucial topic.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the path to war, move into surrender and the aftermath, look at the true human cost, rebuilding from the ashes, the dawn of the nuclear age, and finally, a lasting historical legacy.
Section 1, The Path to War.
So think back to the 1930s. Japan is expanding rapidly across Asia, but they're hitting a massive wall, a severe lack of natural resources, especially oil. They desperately needed it for their population and their growing military. This drive directly fueled their full-scale invasion of China in 1937. Well, the United States was deeply concerned by this aggression, and they applied heavy pressure through economic sanctions, which ultimately culminated in a devastating oil embargo in 1941. To put that into perspective, America supplied nearly 80% of Japan's imported oil at the time. Without it, Japan's military would literally just grind to a halt. Backed into a corner, their leadership made a fateful choice.
That tension? It snapped on December 7, 1941, with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which was a calculated attempt to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Following that, the U.S. officially entered the war, while Japan just rapidly swallowed up territories all across the Pacific, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Guam. In response, America woke up its massive industrial machine. And, deep in secret, American scientists started working on a shadow initiative you've definitely heard of, the Manhattan Project. They were racing against time to build a weapon capable of unimaginable destruction.
Section 2, Surrender and the Aftermath.
Endure the unendurable. Let's fast forward to August 1945. After the terrifying devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with the Soviet Union suddenly declaring war against them, Japan's Supreme War Council was completely deadlocked. Believe it or not, some senior military leaders actually wanted to keep fighting, convinced they could still inflict massive losses on an Allied ground invasion. But Emperor Hirohito did something unprecedented. He stepped in directly, broke the deadlock, and told his government that continuing the war would completely destroy the nation. He declared that Japan must endure the unendurable and accept the Allied terms of the Potsdam Declaration.
But peace was almost stolen at the 11th hour. On the night of August 14th, a group of rogue military officers actually attempted a coup. They wanted to seize the emperor's recorded surrender speech and just keep the war going. Luckily, loyal commanders thwarted the rebellion, and the very next day, millions of Japanese citizens heard their emperor's voice for the very first time on the radio, the famous Jewel Voice broadcast. He announced the war was over due to a, quote, new and most cruel bomb. This was quickly followed by the formal surrender on the USS Missouri, and eventually led to Japan's 1947 Constitution, where they officially renounced war.
Section 3, The True Human Cost. Hibakusha. It translates to bomb-affected people. These are the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for the Hibakusha, just surviving that initial blinding flash was merely the beginning of the nightmare. They carried lifelong physical scars and just unfathomable emotional trauma from losing entire families and neighborhoods in an instant. But beyond that, they faced terrible social discrimination for years. Employers were afraid they'd suddenly get sick. And some people actually, wrongly, believed that radiation exposure was contagious.
A lot of that intense fear stemmed from a totally invisible enemy: radiation. Doctors on the ground were literally baffled. They were seeing horrific symptoms they had rarely, if ever, dealt with before. You had survivors who seemed perfectly fine right after the blast, who suddenly started suffering from high fevers, sudden hair loss, severe weakness, and internal bleeding. You have to remember, medical science back then had a very limited grasp of ionizing radiation. This was a completely unforeseen, terrifying side effect of this new technology.
Which brings us to a number you might be familiar with, 1,000. It represents the story of a young child survivor named Sadako Sasaki. Exposed to the radiation when she was just a toddler, she ended up developing leukemia years later. Hoping for healing, she started folding 1,000 origami paper cranes, inspired by a Japanese legend. Tragically, she passed away at age 12, but her innocent pursuit of health transformed into this massive, enduring international symbol of peace. Even today, kids from all over the world still send folded paper cranes to Hiroshima.
Section 4. Rebuilding from the ashes.
Immediately after the bombings, a lot of experts honestly predicted that the centers of these cities would be totally uninhabitable for decades, just irradiated, dead zones. But the Japanese people didn't wait decades. They got to work almost immediately. Debris was cleared away by hand, temporary shelters went up, water and power infrastructures were painstakingly pieced back together. It's just a stunning contrast, right? The absolute peak of destructive human technology met by the quiet, unified resilience of people putting their lives back together, literally brick by brick.
And as they rebuilt, they made a highly conscious choice not to sweep the past under the rug. The atomic bomb dome, which was one of the very few buildings left standing near the epicenter in Hiroshima, was preserved exactly as it was. Today, it stands alongside beautiful, sprawling peace memorial parks in both cities. They serve as a permanent monument to the victims, a massive testament to human resilience, and a very stark, eternal warning to the rest of us about the reality of nuclear weapons.
Section 5. Dawn of the Nuclear Age. Now I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds. You've likely heard that chilling quote from J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. He recalled that line from Hindu scripture right after witnessing the very first successful nuclear test. Even the architects of this technology immediately felt the profound, terrifying moral weight of what they had just unleashed. They hadn't just built a bigger bomb. They had fundamentally raised the destructive ceiling of humanity. Those 2 mornings in August 1945 didn't just end a war. They instantly thrust the entire world into a high-stakes, terrifying new era of geopolitics.
And things escalated wildly fast. By 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. The U.S. monopoly was over, and the Cold War arms race was officially on. Moving into the 1950s, scientists were already building hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons using fusion that were hundreds, if not thousands of times more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan. This escalation led directly to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came unthinkably close to actually seeing that destruction firsthand.
That ripple effect, we're still living in it. The technology has proliferated way beyond just the US and Russia. Today, nations like China, France, the UK, India, Pakistan, and North Korea all possess nuclear arsenals. And modern warheads are vastly more powerful than the roughly 15 kilotons of TNT yield we saw at Hiroshima. This is exactly why international non-proliferation treaties remain absolutely critical to our global survival today.
Section 6. A lasting historical legacy.
Nearly 80 years later, the justification for these bombings is still fiercely debated. On one side, those who argue in favor point out that it abruptly ended the deadliest war in human history, likely preventing the enormous casualties on both sides that a full-scale ground invasion of Japan would have absolutely guaranteed. Conversely, those arguing against the bombings highlight the staggering loss of civilian life and the horrific lingering suffering caused by radiation. They argue that alternative options like continuing the naval blockade or doing a non-lethal demonstration of the bomb were ignored. History is messy, and this is a debate that remains entirely unresolved.
But maybe the most profound legacy doesn't come from the debaters or the historians at all. It comes from the survivors. So many Hibakusha made this incredible, conscious choice. Having experienced unimaginable loss, they chose not to spend their lives seeking revenge. Instead, they embraced grace. They dedicated their lives to peace advocacy, traveling the globe to share their stories, just to ensure that no city anywhere ever has to suffer that kind of devastation again. They chose dialogue over retaliation.
Which brings us to a final thought to mull over. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a really stark reminder that technological power without wisdom can be absolutely devastating. So consider this. How will the choices made in times of crisis shape humanity for generations to come? Because the choices leaders make in these intense, high-pressure moments, they don't just solve an immediate problem. They send ripples through time, shaping the reality of generations they're never going to meet. Remembering the past isn't just about memorizing history, it's literally the best tool we have for protecting our shared future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.